Hi, yeah, so I'm going to talk about Blake in relation to Allen Ginsberg and in relation to William Wordsworth. So my talk is called Ginsberg, Blake and Wordsworth, Romantic Poetry and Psychedelic Consciousness. So the word enthusiasm was a term much used in Blake's time, the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, when it was used to connote an interest in nonconformist and dissenting forms of spiritual understanding. So it's a real pleasure today to be among fellow enthusiasts, including other people who are going to talk about, or other people who have talked about or are going to talk about similar things. So following me, we've got George who's going to talk about some more aspects of Blake. Yesterday, I believe, Nishay Devano talked about Blake and Wordsworth in relation to Huxley. I wasn't there. But it's I think this, especially this afternoon's papers, really fit very nicely together. And I hope there'll be material of interest for everyone in my paper, whatever their previous knowledge of the subject. So I've spent a good part of the last 10 years researching the intersection between 20th century counterculture and romanticism. And actually yesterday was the third anniversary of me rushing to hand in my PhD thesis at the University of Sussex, which was entitled William Blake in the 1960s, Counterculture and Radical Reception. And you can see some of my published articles if you go to my academia.edu page. And I'm also very happy for people to email me with any thoughts and questions. And I have sort of timed this, and I'm basically going to be a little bit boring and more or less read out my paper. And I've timed it so I should finish in good time. So it'd be really great if people do have questions at the end as well. And if people could wait before everyone's finished their questions before they leave the room as well, and we can have a bit of a kind of conversation. So I imagine there's probably nobody here at the whole conference, let alone in this room, who is not aware of the fact that Jim Morrison named the Doors after a line from Blake's The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. And that the same line was, of course, the source of Aldous Huxley's groundbreaking trip report, The Doors of Perception. But today I'm going to talk about another great 60s Blakean and psychedelic pioneer, Allen Ginsberg, especially his Blake vision of 1948, which I'm going to argue was a sort of starting point for the 1960s, one of many. People love to debate when the 60s sort of started and ended, so I'm going to sort of try and bring it right back to 1948 and claim that Ginsberg's Blake vision, which I'll talk about shortly, is one of many starting points for the 60s. But I want to begin by briefly looking again at this well-known Doors of Perception quote from Blake, including the lines that come immediately before and after it. So you'll see on this slide just a little close-up of the part of the plate from The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, which includes this line in the center of the slide there. But before that, we've got, I'll read out the whole of this and then just to explore a little bit the context, the sort of immediate context in which that line occurs within these couple of lines. But first, the notion that man has a body distinct from his soul is to be expunged. This I shall do by printing in the infernal method by corrosives, which in hell are salutary and medicinal, melting apparent surfaces away and displaying the infinite which was hid. So we can see why this passage from Blake's work in particular, as well as the whole of Blake's oeuvre, was so popular amongst kind of psychedelic pioneers in the 1960s. And we can see Blake here, first of all, extolling a kind of philosophy of non-dualism, which I think is a little bit of what George is going to talk about after in his talk after mine. So Blake says, the notion that man has a body distinct from the soul is to be expunged. The soul and the body are one and the same. And that he's going to show this through his printing. And that he is going to use the infernal method of corrosive. So he used acid, not the acid that we're thinking of, but a much more corrosive kind of acid in his printing process, in this form of printing that he'd more or less invented himself, this sort of particular type of printing. But of course, he's using that metaphorically to talk about burning away melting away apparent surfaces and displaying the infinite which is hid underneath. So we've got a kind of metaphorical discussion of his own printing process, but which is very much intended to refer to the mind itself. And then we have the famous line, if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. Followed by a little passage which surely refers to Plato's cave. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks of his cavern. So this idea that, and this obviously is where Huxley got his reducing valve idea from, this idea that our everyday perception is sort of is narrowed. So when Ginsberg had his 1948 visionary experience, which I'm going to explain in a minute, he was forced to kind of consider and reconsider all of these questions, including the dualism question that's sort of at the beginning of that passage, and also, of course, this idea of burning away, melting away apparent surfaces, and the kind of from a 60s countercultural perspective, the two different meanings of the corrosives, the acid. So just sort of hold those ideas in your mind through the talk, basically. So in this paper, I'm going to... So Ginsberg was also forced to kind of consider through the kind of 15 years or so from 1948 to 1963, he was kind of forced to consider a further set of Blakean contraries, a further sort of pair of concepts, attachment and non-attachment. So as he became more and more interested in Buddhism and knowledgeable about Buddhism, he realized that he was becoming overly attached to his Blakean vision, which I'm going to talk about shortly. So he was forced to confront the sort of problem of spiritual materialism, the problem of becoming attached to one's vision. So this is Ginsberg in the late 40s, before he developed his full sort of 60s full beard look. So all of this led Ginsberg to some very interesting ideas about the relationship between poetry, consciousness, and psychedelics, especially in relation to the poetry of Blake, but also Blake's contemporary, William Wordsworth. Just go back a bit. So the vision itself, this 1948 Blake vision. Over the course of a few days in the summer of 1948, as a 21-year-old student at Columbia University, when he looked like this, Ginsberg had a series of consciousness-expanding experiences, which were by turns blissful, absurd, and frightening. They were not only Blakean in the sense that they seemed to mirror Blake's own visionary experiences, but also in the sense that they were directly linked to and even stimulated by Blake's poetry. Later, Ginsberg began to refer to these 1948 events as his Blake vision in the singular, even though these were in fact multiple events occurring over several days, and insofar as they involved a manifestation of Blake's presence, this was experienced in an auditory rather than a visual form, as he heard the voice of Blake reciting poetry to him. However, as we'll see shortly, these experiences did also involve some visual aspects, even if there was no actual vision of Blake. More than anything else, it's clear from Ginsberg's descriptions that they were experiences of sudden and complete consciousness expansion, in the context of which, as anyone who has had a powerful psychedelic trip knows, individual sense categories such as visual or auditory cease to have discrete meanings. So he called it his Blake vision as a shorthand for what was obviously much more than a visual experience, is what I'm trying to say, and was actually several experiences. I also want to highlight here that while Ginsberg's Blake vision was in almost every respect a classic psychedelic experience, it was not drug-induced, and yet it directly inspired Ginsberg to experiment with the full range of psychedelic substances in the decades that followed. According to Ginsberg himself, his early experiments with a range of such drugs, beginning with his first peyote trip in 1952, continuing through his first use of LSD in 1959, and his first uses of ayahuasca and psilocybin in 1960, were primarily focused on recapturing or recreating the essence of what he referred to as his natural Blake vision. Another interesting point I want to note here is that when Ginsberg later theorized the poetry of Blake and Wordsworth as being especially psychedelic in character and effect, he was actually choosing two of the British Romantic poets who had the least personal experience of mind-altering substances. So whatever people might assume from Blake's visionary productions or philosophy, there's no evidence that Blake himself ever ingested anything stronger than a pint of beer. I think actually it's pretty clear that Blake had a psychedelic consciousness without the need for any drugs. And although Wordsworth was friends with great drug enthusiasts such as Coleridge and De Quincey, he appears to have had no personal interest in following their example. Indeed, quite the opposite. I think Wordsworth was really quite a killjoy. So all of this might give us pause for thought when we consider the meaning of the term psychedelic. So here we've got Ginsberg having a kind of a vision, psychedelic experience, which is not produced by psychedelics, and then using two 19th century poets who themselves had no, as far as we know, experience with any kind of drugs. There's no reference even to Wordsworth or Blake taking opium. They probably did take small doses of opium for pain relief, but there's no evidence even of that. Throughout his life, Ginsberg spoke frequently about the Blake vision. It was a source of inspiration to him personally and to the other beats. But he also, particularly from the mid-60s onwards, began to see it as a kind of burden. In a further link with Romantic poetry, he half-jokingly described his need to continually explain the 1948 vision as a burden similar to that of Coleridge's Ancient Mariner, who's fated to explain his own visionary and terrifying experience to all those he meets. Ginsberg's shift in attitude towards the vision was explicitly signalled within a 1963 poem entitled The Change, which he composed after a long stint in India, by which time he looked very different. However, I want to highlight the fact that, despite what some other scholars have suggested, this change in Ginsberg's attitude towards the vision did not result in a lessening of his interest in Blake. If anything, his reading and understanding of Blake deepened through the 60s and 70s, and neither, in fact, did it result in a lessening of his interest in psychedelics. Rather, as his understanding of both Buddhism and Blake deepened, he became aware, firstly, that attachment, even to a profound vision or psychedelic experience, could be a form of suffering or dukkha. And secondly, that his own Judeo-Christian cultural background, and possibly his readings of texts by Plato and the Neoplatonists, which he was immersed in at the time of the 1948 vision itself, had led him towards an overly dualistic understanding of the experience, in which the material and the spiritual, or the body and the mind, were mistakenly understood as separate rather than one, despite what Blake himself had insisted. The solution, Ginsberg eventually realized, was not to abandon the vision, but rather to pay renewed attention to the embodied material aspects of it. This resulted in an understanding of poetry as a material catalyst for psychedelic experience, so that Blake's poems were understood either as mantras or as akin to tabs of acid, their effects available democratically to all readers and listeners. So this was an important shift from Ginsberg's earlier understanding of the vision, in which he had believed himself to be individually chosen to receive the spirit of Blake, just as Blake himself had received the spirit of his poetic guide Milton, an event which Blake depicted thus. Ginsberg's most detailed description of his 1948 vision is contained within a lengthy interview he gave for the Paris Review in 1965. One aspect of this interview, which seems particularly significant in the light of Ginsberg's 60s efforts to move away from his early dualist understanding of the Blake vision, is his emphasis in the interview on the physical and sexual aspects of the vision. Ginsberg describes, in his candid style, how at the moment that he first heard Blake's voice in 1948, he had been lying on his bed looking through a book of Blake's poems while simultaneously masturbating. A commitment to celebrating the unity of the sensual with the spiritual worlds was to some extent already present in his text of the 1950s. Thus, in his 1955 poem, Footnote to Howl, he declares in Blakean fashion, "Holy, holy, 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 holy. The world is holy, the soul is holy, the skin is holy, the nose is holy, the tongue and cock and hand and arsehole holy. Everything is holy, everybody's holy, everywhere is holy, every day is in eternity, every man's an angel." In the 1965 interview, Ginsberg describes how the visionary experience began with an epiphany, a sudden awakening, in Ginsberg's words, into a totally deeper real universe than I'd been existing in which he understood Blake's poetry to be addressed to him personally at that moment. Simultaneously, he, in his words, heard a very deep, earthen, grave voice in the room, which he knew to be Blake's voice. The voice also seemed to him to be like the voice of the Ancient of Days, and like God had a human voice. As he re-evaluated the experience in the mid-60s and became more deeply involved in the non-theistic religion of Buddhism, he came to understand the Blake vision less as an external visitation from God or Blake, and more as an internal event. Much later in his life, he even suggested that the voice arrived from the future as much as the past. He had now come to the understanding that, in his words, the voice of Blake, the ancient, saturnal voice, is the voice I have now. I was imagining my own body consciousness. In the midst of the events, however, Ginsberg also vowed to never forget, never renege, never deny the experience. Never deny the voice. No, never forget it. Don't get lost mentally wandering in other spirit worlds or American or job worlds or advertising worlds or war worlds or earth worlds. Ginsberg's words here provide a significant suggestion of the forces he considered to be in opposition to his Blakean experience. Some of these, such as the job worlds, advertising worlds, and war worlds, could be seen as constituting the straight world to which an alternative would be provided by the 60s counterculture. At the time of the vision, in 1948, this had not yet arrived. But by his 1965 interview, Ginsberg was at its very epicenter, having used the 1948 vision as a personal springboard to create a counterculture which was infused with Blake. It's also significant that for Ginsberg, the visionary Blakean experience, which might be considered a mere hallucination by those trapped within the job worlds or war worlds, constitutes just the opposite. He called it a totally deeper, real universe than I'd been existing in. Ginsberg's belief that the visionary universe is real puts him in the company of Blake himself, who stated that this world is all one continued vision of fancy or imagination. However, it's important to note that Ginsberg's description of his entry into a totally deeper, real universe, separate from and more real than the everyday Earth worlds, actually puts his vision into a problematically Platonic, dualistic set of terms which do not necessarily correspond with Blake's own worldview, which is essentially non-dualistic and based on a theory of complementary contraries rather than oppositional negations. As the character of Loss asserts in Blake's Jerusalem, negations are not contraries. Contraries mutually exist, but negations exist not. According to the Paris Review interview, and most, though not all, of Ginsberg's other accounts of the vision, the initial ecstatic part of the vision occurred while he was reading a specific Blake poem, Our Sunflower, from the Songs of Experience. And in a sense, the vision was a reading of that poem. It involved a sudden understanding of the poem's combination of particularity and universality. Ginsberg felt an intense self-identification with both the sunflower itself, seeking after that sweet golden clime, and the youth in the poem, who pined away with desire. At the same time as realizing that the poem, in Ginsberg's words, expressed some kind of universal longing for union with some infinite nature. This first ecstatic vision, in which a deeper understanding of the poem came to him, was followed the same day by two further experiences, brought on by reading two more poems from Songs of Experience, The Little Girl Lost and The Sick Rose. As with Our Sunflower, Ginsberg again experienced an intense and overwhelming sense of identification with the central character of The Little Girl Lost, a girl called Laika, while also interpreting the poem in universal terms. So later, remembering the event, Ginsberg said, "I suddenly realized that Laika was me, or Laika was the self. If her heart does ache, then let Laika wake. Wake to what? Wake to the same awareness I was just talking about, of existence in the entire universe. The total consciousness, then, of the complete universe." A similar pattern of personal identification and universal interpretation applied to Ginsberg's reading, or as he experienced it, Blake's reading, because he actually heard Blake's voice reading these poems to him as he was looking at the page. So a similar pattern applied to Ginsberg's reading, or Blake's reading, of The Sick Rose. However, Ginsberg's feeling by that point was no longer ecstatic, but reflected the mood of this dark poem. The sick rose is myself, or self, or the living body, sick because of the mind, which is the worm that flies in the night in the howling storm. But anyway, I experienced the sick rose with the voice of Blake reading it as something that applied to the whole universe, like hearing the voice, like hearing the doom of the whole universe, and at the same time the inevitable beauty of doom. During further visionary experiences, which Ginsberg remembered taking place several days later, this feeling of dark sublime which had accompanied his reading of The Sick Rose was transformed firstly into an awareness of the ridiculousness of existence, and finally into a truly bad trip. All of this without being induced by drugs. Once again, these experiences were either catalyzed by reading Blake or explicitly brought to mind particular poems by Blake. In the bookshop of Columbia University, he was once again leafing over a book of Blake when he came across The Human Abstract, in which Blake explains how the tree of mystery, representing the evils of organized religion and bearing the fruit of deceit, is not externally imposed, but rather grows in the human brain. Ginsberg suddenly found himself, in his words, in that eternal place once more. But this time he was struck by the unsettling absurdity of the universe, and it seemed to him that everyone around him was wearing what he described as horrible, grotesque masks, grotesque because hiding the knowledge from each other. This brought to his mind Blake's poem London. Ginsberg felt that the faces of the people around him bore the marks of weakness, marks of woe, that Blake describes in that poem. And Ginsberg felt that his own purpose must be to break down everybody's masks and roles sufficiently so that everybody has to face the universe and the possibility of the sick rose coming true and the atom bomb. The final vision occurred some days later, again on the campus of Columbia University. Ginsberg describes how it was the same depth of consciousness or the same cosmical awareness, but suddenly it was not blissful at all, but it was frightening. He felt that Blake was urging him, in the words of a Blake poem called Morning, to find the western path right through the gates of wrath. But Ginsberg, in his own words, was too cowardly to pursue that path. Even at the time of the visions themselves, when he was in his early 20s at Columbia University, Ginsberg was keen to contextualize them in terms of other historical accounts of visionary experiences. Although he'd been reading Blake immediately prior to his first vision, he had also been immersing himself in other mystical literature, including St. John of the Cross, St. Teresa of Avila, Plato, and Plotinus, as well as the accounts in William James's The Varieties of Religious Experience. Ginsberg was always very open about the fact that reading these accounts had made him particularly receptive to having some kind of unusual psychological experience, as had the intense loneliness that he was feeling at the time. However, he also believed that the historical moment was aligned for an experience of this kind. Many of his friends had similar, if slightly less dramatic, experiences of personal realization, breakdown, or breakthrough around the same time in 1948. And Ginsberg felt at the time, from his reading of Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West, that this represented the beginning of a new cycle of human existence. Looking back from the 60s, this seemed to be confirmed, with 1948 representing the beginning of Blake's new age, which would arrive fully in the 1960s. Most of all, though, in seeking to understand the visions in the years immediately following them, Ginsberg turns his attention to the idea that Blake's words themselves could be visionary catalysts. Poetry, he wrote, is the secret formula for miracles. At this early stage, he theorized that the words of Blake's poems contained a mystical or hermetic effectiveness in and of themselves, by which the reader or listener might transcend bodily, material reality. However, this interpretation shifted from the mid-60s onwards, and especially after 1968, the year that he began the twin practices of setting Blake's poems to music and engaging in very long Buddhist and Hindu mantra chanting sessions. Now he realized that it was precisely the bodily, physical effects of rhythmic sound and breathing patterns which might cause a chemical change in the mind, similar to that achieved through psychedelics. So in other words, he, through the sort of 15 years or so from 1948 to the mid-60s, Ginsberg sort of spent a lot of time thinking very philosophically about the Blake experience, and goes from an understanding of Blake's poems as being kind of mystical, magical catalysts to, in a way, a more physically embodied understanding of the reading. Even the reading in one's mind of a poem kind of involves different sorts of breath work and different kinds of physical changes in the body. And so he comes to kind of understand Blake's the effect of Blake's words as being a more physical effect on the body rather than a kind of magical effect. In the 1965 Paris Review interview, Ginsberg speculated that, in his words, certain combinations of words and rhythms actually had an electrochemical reaction in the body, which could catalyze specific states of consciousness. I think that's probably what happened to me with Blake, he said. I'm going to skip forward a little bit here and just explain how Ginsberg also, by the late 60s, came to the realization or the belief that it wasn't just Blake's poetry which was particularly psychedelic in its effect and in its kind of descriptions. And in particular, he sort of seized upon the poetry of William Wordsworth. And just earlier on this afternoon, we had Ginsberg's poem "Whale's Visitation" up on the board behind us. A poem which Ginsberg wrote in 1967 while high on LSD, but also very much under the influence of William Wordsworth's poetry. So I want to kind of conclude here by just very briefly concluding that. So this is Ginsberg in Wales in 1967, when he wrote Whale's Visitation under the influence of LSD and of William Wordsworth. This is some quotes from Ginsberg. Sorry, back a bit there. I want to conclude just by a little piece of testimony that Ginsberg gave before the US Senate in 1966. Kind of a bit extraordinarily, Ginsberg was called upon to kind of give evidence when the Senate was considering the issue of drugs in 1966, and they allowed Ginsberg to come and talk to them about psychedelics. And in his 1966 US Senate testimony, Ginsberg says, "I saw a friend dancing long-haired before green waves under cliffs of titanic nature that Wordsworth described in his poetry." This is describing an LSD trip that he'd had recently. "I accept the evidence of my own sense that, with psychedelics as catalysts, I have seen the world more deeply at specific times, and that has made me more peaceable." And in that poem, piece of testimony, he's drawing on Wordsworth's poem Tintern Abbey, which is the poem that particularly influenced Whale's Visitation, and particularly on the passage which goes like this: "While with an eye made quiet by the power of harmony and the deep power of joy, we see into the life of things." So in these and other statements, Ginsberg again and again defines within a psychedelic context Wordsworth's poetic vision of what Wordsworth and Coleridge called the one life, a concept which lies at the centre of Romanticism. Ginsberg also makes it clear that he sees no essential difference between his own spontaneous Blake vision of 1948, the visionary experiences described by Wordsworth in Wordsworth's poetry, and an LSD trip. For Ginsberg, Romanticism, whether of the Blakean or Wordsworthian variety, is inherently psychedelic. In making this claim, he locates the beat movement and 60s counterculture within a romantic context, but also defines Blake and Wordsworth through the context of their countercultural reception.